Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and I am going to pick up where I left off on the first part of the presentation on sexuality, law, and social control, and this will be part two, and I'll start with a brief discussion of pornography. Okay, how do we know what is considered pornographic? How do we know what's considered legal or illegal? And where's that fine line? And how has technology changed this debate? And finally, I would ask, how can pornography be harmful? Again, there's a lot of history and research. There's actually a journal devoted to pornography research. And so a lot going on. I've studied this kind of on and off, been involved in a case before back in the 80s involving pornography, and I ended up not testifying in the case. The case was concluded through a settlement, but I was getting ready to testify in a case. So I was really started studying it to prepare, and kind of looking at the changes that have occurred historically and how this relates again to the legal system. But when we start looking at brief history, we start thinking, I really feel old because we have paintings basically, and then we have movies like reel to reel. That's when I was alive. During that early phase, reel to reel, interesting. People would have the old movie projectors, and the tape, the film would, play on that reel, and they'd show it somewhere in a room, projecting it onto the screen, often black and white, and maybe even without sound, things of that nature back in the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s. And then they started really moving into theaters that showed, adult movies, X-rated movies, if you will. And they also had boxes that people would go into, and they would, I guess it was kind of like, I almost want to say like an outhouse, but there's no toilet or anything in there. But I mean that size, like a closet maybe. They would go in there, and there would be like a film started, and they would feed the machine quarters to see the film, and they had some privacy in this closet type device, and so. I'll just leave it there, and then we moved to videos, and we're talking about VHS. Stores sold cassette tapes, and anyone who was working in the field at the time, when they started to see video cameras become widely distributed, they knew home porn was going to take off, and it did. But they also had professional actors and actresses who were very well known and appeared in many films or movies that were on video. Then we moved from video to DVD, and then the internet. And I also would mention virtual reality, and of course, what is next, and we see a lot more probably pornographic material and sexually explicit material because of the rapid production and wide distribution of cameras, making them smaller, more efficient to use, greater amount of storage, and so we've seen this situation occur with the internet. I'll go back historically, back in the 80s, when I was working in Child Protective Services, and really my cases were sexual abuse cases, sex crimes cases, and I was at a hospital-based agency. I remember doing a brief training with a couple of law enforcement officers from the community, and what I had done for them is showed them how to go on how to use modem to connect to bulletin boards and to do a search and to find out what people were communicating about online. And I was able to discover a small ring of child sex abusers, and I was also able to give the officers their phone numbers they had posted on the bulletin boards. I actually gave them the printout and showed them how to do that, and they thanked me and left, and went to do their investigation and everything. And I think back at just how that technology then, that I could have never imagined where we'd be 30 years later, or even 40 years later, I should say, maybe. So looking at the history and the control is very intriguing to do. We still run into the definitions problem, and three basic standards looking at Miller versus California 1973, trying to determine if something's pornographic or not, whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interests, such as appeals to the sexual interest causing a person to become sexually aroused. 2, whether the work or communication depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by applicable state law. And 3rd, whether the work of communication taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So again, trying to determine if something is obscene and if something is pornographic gets into that problem. Remember the Club-Wana example, is that nude dancing, would that be considered obscene? Well, if you apply Miller v. California, well, first you have to ask, what are the community standards in Fern Park? Got to do some surveys there, find out. Does it appeal to prurient interests? Well, it seems that maybe. And then the second one, whether the work or communication depicts or describes in patently offensive ways sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. Well, they're doing Shakespeare, they're doing Macbeth. So we run into a problem there. What's the difference between clothed actors and actresses and unclothed actors and actresses doing Macbeth? That's really becomes a big legal issue there. And then 3rd, whether the work of communication taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, scientific value. It's Macbeth. You can start having an argument about the quality of the acting, but I don't think that would be relevant there. And maybe they were really good actors, or actresses rather. Maybe they were really, and maybe they weren't. I don't know. I didn't attend any of those productions, and I didn't see any videos. I just read some reviews in the newspaper, and I think that there was almost a comical twist to those that were presented in the newspaper in that sense. Some have tried to look at pornography, defining that as something that's degrading, humiliating, and violent, versus erotica, which would be consenting, mutually pleasurable, nonviolent interactions. And then Lentz and Malamuth really been studying pornography for years and years and years, a wealth of information about that, but they kind of come up with different models, and they come up with a conservative moralist model that focuses on obscenity, and a liberal model that looks at pornography basically being harmless fantasy, and then a feminist perspective which looks at harm to women. Basically, in looking at the research, it would be important to differentiate between erotica and nonviolent pornography and violent pornography. And we see that early research found that the relationship between pornography consumption and support of violence against women is significant but weak, but it's more pronounced for violent pornography. And so aggression and sexuality combined seems to be the major problem, especially for those predisposed to sexual violence. And that was from a 2010 study by several well-known researchers who've been studying this for a very long time: Kingston, Malamuth, Fedorov, and Marshall. From the importance of individual differences in pornography use, theoretical perspectives and implications for treatment of sex offenders, from the Journal of Sex Research, volume 46, pages 216 to 232. We do know that, though, there are risks to adolescents and who view pornography, and Bryant, in an article, Adolescence, Pornography and Harm in Youth Studies Australia, back in 2010, pages 18 to 26, volume 29, pointed out some of the risks having to do with problems with normal sexual development, also encouragement of certain lifestyles, undermining an adolescent's well-being, mental health well-being, and may also encourage problematic relationships and maybe even sexual violence as well. So the content really is important when evaluating what might be harmful. And we're getting into more technological interventions to try to help keep children and adolescents safe from pornography. Software that blocks, for example, genitals and things of that sort. And also another issue that we see that has become very problematic is sexting. And I'm going to rely on Shaflin's article back from 2009. It's only a picture: Sexting, Smutty Snapshots, and Felony Charges, from Visual Studies, volume 24, pages 258 to 268. And you might say, well, you're using a 22-year-old article. Well, let's see what has changed, or if things have got more complex, or what's going on. But Shefflin says that sexting really started around 2005. It occurs pretty frequently with adolescents and also adults. And we might ask, what were the historical precursors for sexting? And how does this relate to media, culture, techno culture, visual culture, and adolescent culture? But there's a lot of legal issues as well. For example, voluntary versus consensual versus coerced, and looking at the legal implications of the sexters versus the sextees, those who choose to receive a sext and those who don't, those who delete versus those who save the images, and those who keep it for themselves versus those who distribute. And obviously the age of the actors involved is very important as well. And obviously there's some different motivations for sexting that those that are involved in relationships may do this as part of their sexual behavior. It may also be done flirting. It may be done as to get feedback, and it may also be done to harass people, and so we see multiple things going on there. Negative consequences to sexting, of course, would be things such as regret, embarrassment, a harmed reputation, problems if one has family, mental health issues, arrest, prosecution, and if minors are involved, being labeled as a sex offender. And so what I'm interested in, of course, is the remedies. What do we do? And, what have we done in the last, 15, 16 years to deal with this situation? And, how do we apply social control in a way? Do we go a legal way, or do we go a mental health way? Or, what do we do here? Do we go a technological way, or a combination? And then finally, I have a couple slides on paraphilias. And a paraphilia is a recurrent sexual response to unusual or unacceptable stimulus. Interesting thing here is that it may be legal or illegal depending on the act, location, the age of the participants, and so on. And so a lot of this also relates to culture and culture considerations. And Berga, Poplio, and McMullen in a 2010 article, Paraphilias Across Cultures, Contexts and Controversies, from the Journal of Sex Research, volume 47, pages 242 to 246, have really done a wonderful job of analyzing how culture and paraphilias are related. For example, is the behavior considered a disease, a pathology, or is it considered an illness that affects others in that sense? Also looking at some of the attitudes in regards to paraphilias. One of the things to look at is what is tolerated in a particular society or culture, and what are the legal codes, and how does that relate to certain rules or regulations that are motivated by other institutions, for example, religion. And also looking at the differences over time. So very fascinating to take a look at. A lot of times in my own research, what I've looked at is sexual scripting theory and how that relates to try to understand what we're analyzing. And Gagnon and Simon, in their Human Sexuality's famous textbook, talked about this sexual scripting and asking basically the who, what, when, where, why, and how, answering those questions for any particular sexual behavior. So a lot going on with those scenarios, and again, I try to be brief here in both of these videos, so I'll wrap this one up. Thank you.